get started. My name is Sean Trapp. I am the coordinator for the Upstate Coalition of Reason, and I am here with Bill Clute and Silverman. You hear me better now?
Yes.
Much better, okay. I got a signal in the back to raise the roof, not to raise the voice. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the Greenville Unitarian Universalist Fellowship for hosting tonight's event. John Nelson and Kathy Yaggers back there. Fantastic people who have coordinated this along with both Bill and Herb. And we're delighted to have both of them here. And the title of tonight's debate is, Does the Christian God Exist? Now, many of you may have the answer to that in your heads already, but I ask that you indulge both Bill and Herb for the time of their debate tonight, and listen to both points, and to consider them, and to be considerate of not only them, but of each other. So we ask that you hold your applause, no shouting, no yelling, no signs. We don't want to have to ask people to leave.
Bathrooms are down this hall.
Yes. Yes, please take notice of the exits as well, should you need a rise. There are exits over here to the left, to your right, and to the back. But yes, the restrooms are to the back and to the right, should you need to do that. It's very casual, come and go. As long as you don't cross up in front of here, then you're good to go, because we are recording this, courtesy of Tom Ledbetter, who has graciously offered his service to do so. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce both Bill and Herb, and then we'll go over the debate rules for tonight that both Bill and Herb have agreed to.
It's Herb.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so debating in the affirmative, does the Christian God exist, is Bill Clute. Bill is the chapter director of the Greenville chapter of Reasonable Faith, a nationwide group founded by William Lane Craig that aims to provide a reasonable Christian perspective on the most important issues concerning truth today. He is also the founder of Bill Clute Airshows and pilots a plane that he, in part, with his father, built. He is a graduate of UNC Asheville in a degree in computer science. Herb Silverman, debating in the opposite, dubbed the unflappable atheist. Herb is the founder of the Secular Coalition for America and the Secular Humanists of the Low Country in Charleston, South Carolina. He has written for many news publications on atheism and humanism, and is the author of 2 books, Candidate Without a Prayer and An Atheist Stranger in a Strange Religious Land, which I will note that copies are available here for a nominal fee. Should you choose to do that, you may do so at the end of tonight's debate. He is most notable in South Carolina for having won a unanimous decision in the state Supreme Court nullifying the religious test for public office. He holds a PhD in mathematics from Syracuse University and is the distinguished professor of mathematics at the College of Charleston. Did I get that right, both of you? Anything you want to add? Okay. So the debate rules tonight, both participants will be making an opening statement. They will have 18 minutes for their opening statements. There will be a 10-minute opening statement rebuttal allowance for each person, should they choose to take it. Bill will be the first person to open. Herb will follow thereafter. Bill will be first in the 10-minute rebuttal, followed by Herb. There will be a debater rebuttal Q&A section after that. Bill and Herb will have a question and answer period. Each will have, for up to 20 minutes, that section will go on. They will be allowed to ask up to 3 questions of each other. The moderator, myself, will determine if a question is sufficiently covered and to move on to the next question. Herb will ask the first question of Bill. If we run out of time, both gentlemen will definitely get to ask an equal number of questions of the other person. There will be an allotment of 5 minutes each for closing statements. Herb will go last in the closing statements. There will be an audience Q&A time. I will emphasize that each person ask a short question and not make a long statement. Up to 30 seconds to ask your question. There will be a 2-minute response from whom the question is directed to, with an option of a 1-minute rebuttal from the opposite party. The length of the audience Q&A portion will be up to me. I promise. I won't cut it that short. I will have the option of asking questions during that period, but I probably will not. Again, I must emphasize debate decorum. Both Bill and Herb have graciously given of their time tonight, and we ask that everybody be respectful of both of them and of each other in the audience. No outbursts, cheering, yelling, threats, protests of any kind. Folks engaging in that type, unfortunately, will be asked to leave to the right here. Without further delay, it is my privilege and honor to introduce Bill Clute and Herb Silverman.
I'd like to thank the Piedmont Humanists, United Coalition of Reason, and the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship for organizing, hosting, and allowing me to be a part of this event. Now, in a discussion like this, it's important that we be clear about what our topic is. The topic for this evening is, does the Christian God exist? Our topic is not, is the Bible inerrant? And it's not, do we like the Bible? And it's not, do Christians behave better than non-Christians? Those are interesting and valid topics, but they're not the topic tonight, which is simply, does the Christian God exist? There seems to be 3 possible answers: yes, no, or maybe. I will be arguing, yes, the Christian God exists, and we'll leave it to Herb to defend either the no or the maybe option. In this discussion, we also need to be clear on what we mean by God and Christianity. The definition of God that I will be referring to this evening is the creator of the universe and all that is within it, the uncaused cause, a person with intelligence, a powerful force, but not simply a force. When I say Christianity, I'm referring to the worship of Jesus Christ as God and Savior, which requires the belief that Jesus was crucified, died, and was resurrected in bodily form. My approach this evening will be like a police investigator. The investigator surveys the scene. He makes notes of the evidence: broken glass, open door, fingerprints. He determines which of the evidence could be considered a fact in the case. He then looks for a cause or best explanation for those facts. He follows the evidence to where it leads, regardless of whether or not he likes the conclusion. Our scene to investigate this evening is the entire world we live in, the universe and the people within it. We begin with the universe. I believe we would all agree that the universe exists and that we live in it. But why does the universe exist? Everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. Either something caused it or it exists necessarily. So what is the explanation of our universe? It used to be believed that our universe always existed, that it existed necessarily, but we now have good reasons to believe that this universe has not always existed. That is to say that its existence was caused. Here are a few reasons why we conclude that the universe has not always existed. If the universe has always existed, then it must be eternal in the past. If it is eternal in the past, then an infinite number of events have taken place in the past. Think about that. If an infinite number of events have taken place in the past, we could never trace backwards through all those events to get to the infinite first one in the past. We could never reach the infinite one in the past because the past would be endless. Now consider if we were on the other end of the spectrum, trying to get to our current time. Just as we could not traverse an infinite number of events in the past to get to the first one, we would not be able to start at the other end and traverse an infinite number of events to get to our current time. But we are in our current time. Therefore, there must not have been an infinite number of events in the past to be traversed to get here. It follows from this philosophical exercise that our universe must not be eternal in the past. It must have had a beginning. Philosophical proofs are good, but we can also look to modern science. First, we can look to the second law of thermodynamics. Stephen Hawking wrote, quote, "If your theory disagrees with the second law of thermodynamics, it is in bad trouble. In fact, the theory that the universe has existed forever is in serious difficulty with the second law of thermodynamics. The second law states that disorder always increases with time. It indicates that there must have been a beginning. Otherwise, the universe would be in a state of complete disorder by now, and everything would be at the same temperature," end quote. Because of this second law, the ideas of an eternal universe and oscillating universes were dismissed. A second piece of evidence from science comes from the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, or BGV for short. Alexander Vilenkin described the theorem saying, quote, "If the universe is on average expanding, then its history cannot be indefinitely continued into the past." The BGV theorem is sweeping in its generality. It makes no assumptions about gravity or matter. Gravity may be attractive or repulsive, light rays may converge or diverge, and even general relativity may decline. The theorem would still hold, end quote. Our universe, as well as multiverse theories and oscillating theories, are covered by this theorem. They too must have a beginning. Given these facts, we can construct the following deductive argument. 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This is a logically sound argument, meaning that if the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. Premise 1 is based on the principle of sufficient reason. If it is false, then we should be asking why we don't see things pop into existence all the time uncaused. I provided 1 philosophical and 2 scientific arguments in support of premise 2, that the universe had a beginning. Therefore, the conclusion that the universe has a cause seems to be pretty solid. Now, since all space, time, and matter came into existence when the universe came into existence, it follows that the cause could not have been spatial, temporal, or material, but it must have been non-spatial, not bound by time, immaterial, and I think it's safe to say it would have been powerful. That is our first piece of evidence. Our next piece of evidence comes from the fine-tuning of the cosmos. Fine-tuning is the term that scientists use to describe the narrow range of values that certain quantities and constants of the universe must fall within for intelligent life to be possible in our universe. The odds that these values would fall within this narrow range is incredibly small. There are about 24 or so of these quantities and constants that include things like the strength of gravity, the weak nuclear force, and the speed of light. Let's look at 2 of the other values, the entropy of the early universe and the cosmological constant. Entropy is a measure of unusable energy. Sir Roger Penrose has calculated that the odds of the entropy level of the early universe to be within the range to allow for the future development of life is just 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. To get an idea of the size of this number we're talking about, consider the number of atoms in our vast universe. The low estimate is only 10 to the power of 78. In layman terms, that is 10 quadrillion vigintillion. That is vastly smaller than the number Dr. Penrose is talking about. What he is saying is that if we had 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123 slots and had to put a peg in a slot to win, there would just be 1 out of those very many slots that would be a winner. The odds of landing in that winning slot by chance is incredibly unlikely. The cosmological constant is like anti-gravity, a repulsive force. The precision of this force is at 1 part in 10 to the power of 120. According to Leonard Susskind, Stanford University professor of theoretical physics, if this force was just the slightest bit larger, the galaxies would be blasted apart and prevent stars from forming. Without stars, intelligent life could not exist. As Susskind has said, quote, "Nobody thinks that's accidental. That is not a reasonable idea," end quote. It's important that we understand that we need all of these 24 or so values to be within their very narrow range. So it's not just a matter of being incredibly lucky once. We must be incredibly lucky 24 or so times. That would be quite a coincidence. In our daily lives, when we see unlikely things happen just 2 or 3 times, we begin to suspect that it's not a coincidence. If chance is not a reasonable idea, what is? What about the idea that the universe has to be the way it is, that it is physically necessary? Well, that idea would be saying that a universe that does not permit life is virtually impossible. But surely it would seem that a universe that does not permit life is at least possible, and that is what a majority of cosmologists today believe. The research into multiverses assumes that the vast majority of the universes in the multiverse do not permit life. But scientists have also learned that even if a multiverse exists, it too must be finely tuned. The multiverse doesn't answer the question of fine-tuning, but simply moves the question from our universe to the multiverse. We can lay out the situation with the following argument. 1. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. 2. It is not due to physical necessity or chance. 3. Therefore, it is due to design. A functional design such as this, which is different from just an aesthetic pattern in nature, requires a designer. That is our next clue. We now know that we are looking for a form of intelligence that is capable of designing and is also non-spatial, not bound by time, immaterial, and powerful. Our first two pieces of evidence came from the very large-scale universe. Now let's look at the very small scale for our third one. One of the great discoveries of modern science has been the information encoded on the DNA molecule. This information has been compared to computer code and blueprints that provide details for cell production. While this has been one of the greatest discoveries, it has also brought about one of the greatest mysteries. Where did this information come from? Some believe that it came from the RNA molecule, but that just moves the question from DNA to RNA. Could this information be the result of evolution? Well, that would seem to be problematic. This information is needed for cell copying to take place. Evolution relies on the copying. Without this information, no copying can take place. No information, no copying. No copying, no evolution. A computer code can be represented as binary code, a string of ones and zeros. Flipping the values of any of the ones or zeros can cause a program to lose functionality or even all functionality. It is highly unlikely that these binary values could be randomly put together to create a functional program. Instead, it requires an intelligent being, a computer programmer, to put them in meaningful order. I see no reason why we shouldn't think the same about the information found in DNA, that it came from an intelligent being. It seems not only does the copying require information, but also requires something to translate the information, as well as the tools to carry out the instructions. It seems almost necessary that the cells were preloaded with information, a translator, and the necessary tools, and that would seem to require a designer. This provides us with an additional piece of evidence for a designer to go along with the cause of the universe that is also non-spatial, not bound by time, immaterial, and powerful. It's clear to our investigator that the evidence shows that our universe was no accident. We can also recognize that the traditional understanding of God is consistent with this cause. My previous arguments provided evidence for the existence of God, but that God isn't necessarily the Christian God. What separates Christianity from all other worldviews is the life and death of a first-century Jewish man named Jesus, who became known as the Christ. So my next piece of evidence is the origins of Christian belief. To understand this argument, we first must understand what was meant by resurrection and Messiah to the first-century Jews and pagans. Both the Jews and pagans agreed on what resurrection was. They were in agreement that resurrection referred to a return to bodily existence after death. For the most part, pagans didn't believe it was possible or even desired. Most Jews, except the Sadducees, believed it would happen, but not until the end times, when their kingdom is restored, and at that time, all the saints would be raised together. Resurrection wasn't a spirit life after death. A belief in spirit life after death was common in the first century amongst both Jews and pagans. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright has stated that resurrection was understood to be life after death. The second term we must understand is Messiah, which is the Jewish term for the Christ. The first century Jew was looking for the arrival of the Messiah. The Messiah would be one that would lead the Jews to victory over their oppressors and restore their kingdom to its previous glory. With those terms in place, let's look at some facts of early Christianity. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, wrote that Christ was executed in Judea under the rule of Pontius Pilate, but his following had spread all the way to Rome by the time of Nero, around 60 AD. A Roman governor named Pliny, also writing in the early 2nd century, wrote that Christians would sing to Christ as if he was a god. The writings of the Jewish historian Josephus contain 2 references to Jesus. The authenticity of one of the references is very questionable, but the one I'm going to reference has little dispute. In this reference, from the late 1st century, he writes about James being the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ. The 2nd century cynic Lucian wrote that Christ persuaded his followers to deny other gods and worship him. Now, these followers were Jews who knew that only God was to be worshipped. From these 4 non-Christian sources, we can know that in the 1st century Judea, a man named Jesus was executed under the rule of Pontius Pilate. He had a brother named James. He was called the Christ. People sang to him as if to a god. He taught that only he is to be worshipped. This belief about Jesus being the Christ and being treated as God had spread from Judea to Rome by the time of Nero, around 60 AD. Now that's some good information, but it leads us to some questions. Why would they be calling Jesus the Christ? And why would they sing to him as if to a god? They were expecting the Christ, or Messiah, to free them from their oppressors and restore the kingdom. But the Jews were still under the rule of the oppressors, and this Jesus had been executed by those same oppressors. According to their expectations of a Messiah, this Jesus would have been a total failure. There were other Messiah figures before and after the time of Jesus. When those Messiah figures failed and were executed, their followers didn't come away claiming he was still the Messiah. They either found another Messiah movement to follow or gave up on any idea of a Messiah. Why was this Jesus different? Now we have another ancient source we can go to. This is a very early Christian creed that predates all of the writings of the New Testament. New Testament scholars, both Christian and non-Christian, agree that this creed goes back to within 20 years of the crucifixion and possibly to within 2 years. The creed is referenced in 1 Corinthians 15 and speaks of Christ dying for our sins, being buried and raised, and then appearing to up to 500. Now a Messiah that was dead and stayed dead wouldn't keep a following, but a Messiah that was raised from the dead, a resurrected Messiah, would be one that defeated the ultimate weapon of the oppressors, death. The Jews knew that only God could raise a dead man, so this Jesus was vindicated by God, and his teachings were vindicated. He was called the Messiah because he taught he was the Messiah. He was worshipped as God because he taught that he is God. Resurrection for these early Christians went from being the minor teaching that it was in Judaism to their central message. Naturalistic explanations that are often suggested is that they hallucinated that they saw Jesus, or they made up the story, or maybe even stole the idea from pagan myths. None of these alternate explanations work. Hallucinations are personal experiences with no external reality. They aren't group experiences. The idea that they made it up doesn't work because if they wanted anyone to follow them, they would have made up a story that fit neatly in their previous beliefs. But this story wasn't close. Pagan myths don't work because there are no pagan myth parallels to the resurrection of Jesus. I don't have time during this speech to explain the details, but I'll be glad to address them during the Q&A period if anyone is interested. So the best explanation is that Jesus really was resurrected from the dead. The only prerequisite is that God exists. And I showed with my earlier arguments that it is most likely that he does.
Thank you, Bill, for your opening. And now I'll give my opening. And I'll begin by telling you what atheism is, then what I think Christianity is. If you disagree about Christianity, please let me know. I'll then make my case for why I think atheism is much more reasonable. Finally, I'll explain why I consider morality far more important than theology. An atheist is simply someone without a belief in any gods. I can't prove there are no gods. I just find no credible evidence, which is also why I don't believe in astrology or alien abduction by UFOs. For instance, suppose I tell you that the universe was created just 30 minutes ago, and a supernatural being planted false memories in all of you. You can't show I'm wrong, but wouldn't you want evidence before believing it? The burden of proof is on those who assert a belief, not on those who don't accept it. I understand the appeal of religion. Fear of death can lead to a longing for an afterlife where we can be united forever with loved ones in eternal bliss. But it's important to distinguish between the world as we know it and the world as we'd like it to be. Many people believe they've had personal experiences with gods, and that can be quite comforting. But with over 7,000 gods that humans believe in, how do they decide? Do people investigate the world religions and select the one with the most reasonable faith? I think not. As it turns out, there's a remarkable coincidence. The overwhelming majority choose the religion of their parents. I learned to believe in the biblical God, Yahweh, not Jesus. Why? Because I was born into a Jewish family. Had I been born into a Christian family, I'd likely have believed Jesus is Lord. Most Asians are Buddhists, people from India, largely Hindu, Saudi Arabians, Muslims, and here in the U.S., primarily Christian. Religious belief is based more on geography than on theology. With all the conflicting faith beliefs in the world, they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. Countless scientific discoveries have transformed God beliefs. Most people no longer attribute natural phenomena like eclipses, earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods to supernatural causes. There will always be unanswered questions, but scientific gaps are not evidence for a God of the gaps. Science relies on experimentation and logical deductions. It thrives on disagreements and a willingness to question assumptions critically. When scientists don't have an answer, they say, "I don't know," and continue to search for evidence until a consensus is reached. That's why science works the same way throughout the world, including countries with very different God beliefs. On the other hand, true believers, whether in astrology, psychics, tarot cards, or religion, look for and focus on information that supports their beliefs while overlooking or downplaying contradictory evidence. This is known as confirmation bias. Nevertheless, overwhelming scientific evidence and human rights advances have forced many religious believers to modify or reinterpret their ancient beliefs. For instance, our universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old, with humans around for only 200,000 years. If there is a creator, he, she, or it seems to care more for bacteria, which has been around for 3.5 billion years. And even cockroaches were on Earth more than 300 million years before humans. To put all this on a more understandable scale, if we represented the universe as a 24-hour day, then humans would appear only in the last 2.5 seconds. I think it's sheer ego to believe that the entire universe was created for our benefit. Now let's move from science to Christianity. I can't generalize because there are over 33,000 Christian denominations with contradictory dogmas. However, here's what I think are fundamental beliefs, though not embraced by all Christians. The first human couple committed an original sin that tainted humans with an inherently sinful nature. So, God sent his son Jesus, born of a virgin, to be tortured to death as atonement. Jesus was then resurrected and appeared to a small band of followers for a brief time before ascending to heaven. If we believe this story and embrace Jesus as Lord and Savior, we will be rewarded with eternal life in heaven. Otherwise, we are doomed to the fires of hell. Now, I hope you can understand why I find it difficult to believe that a loving God created humans who he knew would be miserable sinners deserving of hell, which he also created. Then, thousands of years later, God decided to forgive humans for something they were born with because a naive first couple, Adam and Eve, took dietary advice from a talking snake. But rather than just forgive us, God chose a convoluted method. He sent his Son, who is also himself, down to earth. God then sacrificed himself to save us from himself. And we will be rewarded or punished for eternity based solely on whether we believe this unbelievable story. Scientist Carl Sagan said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Claims about God, and certainly claims about the resurrection, are extraordinary, but I have yet to hear good evidence. Let me sum up the so-called evidence for the resurrection. The Bible. That's it. There's nothing written about the resurrection of Jesus other than what's in the Christian Bible. Nothing from Roman or Jewish historians of that time who carefully chronicled major events. Furthermore, the Gospels were written some 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death by anonymous supporters who had never even met Jesus. And Jesus wasn't the only New Testament figure to rise from the dead around that time. According to Matthew 27, at the moment Jesus died, there was an earthquake, and graves opened, and lots of Jews were resurrected and went to Jerusalem, where they were seen by many. Again, no sources outside the Christian Bible. Wouldn't we have expected to hear something from the resurrected Jews and their families? Resurrection stories were popular at the time, and associating Jesus with previously resurrected gods would have been one of the most effective ways to convert others to their new religion. Early church fathers, such as Justin Martyr, acknowledged that basic Christian doctrines, like God's having virgin births, performing miracles, being crucified, raised from the dead, ascending to heaven, were also in earlier Greco-Roman religions. The best explanation Christian apologists could offer was that such stories came from demons and were false, while the same stories in Christianity were true. The belief that Satan placed these earlier stories in other cultures to confound later Christians became known as diabolical mimicry. Now, I know that most Christians are skeptical of other religions, as am I, even skeptical of other kinds of Christians. For instance, how about this Christian resurrection story? After Jesus died, but before he went to heaven, Jesus stopped in the United States, in Missouri. The information was chiseled on gold plates in Egyptian hieroglyphics and buried in Palmyra, New York. In 1827, the angel Moroni led a man named Joseph Smith to the gold plates and magic stone, which enabled Smith to translate the plates into English. When Jesus returns, he will again go to Missouri. How do we know all this? Because it's in the Book of Mormon, one of the fastest growing Christian religions. Those of you who don't believe this resurrection story should understand why I don't believe yours. And why did Jesus appear only to his small band of followers? Jesus was a Jewish preacher who instructed his apostles to preach only to Jews. However, most Jews then and now do not believe that Jesus is a God. If belief in a resurrection is necessary for salvation, wouldn't the merciful God provide evidence to outsiders and skeptics? Without such evidence, it makes more sense not to believe. But perhaps evidence was not that important. Christianity began as a doomsday cult with emphasis on the end times. The Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, all say that the current generation would not pass before Jesus returns. Well, it's been about 2,000 years, and something apparently went wrong. So, Christians began to realize that their story did not sound very credible. which is why they actively discouraged reason and doubt. For instance, John's Gospel, the last written, and after previous generations had passed away, says, "Blessed are those who have not seen, yet still believe." Martin Luther said, "Whoever wants to be a Christian should tear the eyes out of his reason." And in Romans 14, blind faith is a requirement. He who doubts is damned. Why is it so horrible to doubt? Because if people approached religion with the same kind of doubt and skepticism as scientists do in their work, there would be few believers. Here's what 3rd century Christian apologist Tertullian had to say about the resurrection. The Son of God died. Just because it is absurd, it is to be believed. And he was buried and rose again. It is certain because it is impossible. If that makes any sense to you, Bill, please explain later. And why hasn't one of the competing theories about gods produced a consensus? God remains as mysterious today as 2,000 years ago, despite countless theological and philosophical arguments and wars, including wars between different Christian sects. If God's mission was to have religious believers fight endlessly over specific meanings in their ambiguous and contradictory holy books, then God can say, "Mission accomplished." As I said earlier, I consider morality more important than theology. If loving and worshiping a God inspires you to treat others fairly, that's great. Unfortunately, love of a God all too often makes people less loving of those who don't believe in worship as they do. Some biblical morality is certainly worth keeping, like love your neighbor, don't murder, steal, or lie, but these practices predate Christianity and are necessary for survival of any culture, with or without religion. However, the Bible has also been quoted to justify slavery, misogyny, anti-Semitism, executing blasphemers and homosexuals, burning witches and heretics, and genocides. Churches on spiritual grounds have defended such practices. In science, we build from the wisdom of our ancestors, and science changes in light of new evidence, unlike those who subscribe to biblical inerrancy and believe nothing in the Bible is wrong. It just makes sense to discard some horrendous biblical views that were written in a pre-scientific era when democracy was non-existent and kings ruled by divine right. So, how do we make moral decisions? One criterion is to look at what has withstood the test of time in creating a livable society. As an atheist and secular humanist, I think ethical values are derived from human needs and interests and are tested and refined by experience. We are part of a natural world, the result of unguided evolutionary change. Our ancestors thrived because traits we call moral were beneficial for survival. Such favorable genes were passed to us over many generations. Natural selection could have provided us with a psychological makeup that favors cooperation, empathy, and the interests of the entire community, which is the essence of human morality. I think morality is partly learned and partly innate. We need ongoing discussions as we continue to revise and refine our views about how best to maximize happiness, minimize suffering, and promote human dignity. I don't think we should give credit to a deity for our accomplishments or blame satanic forces when we behave badly. We should take personal responsibility for our actions. We don't have to believe in a certain type of God or in any God to be kind and compassionate to our fellow human beings. Our deeds are more important than our creeds. Since we don't actually know what lies beyond, we should focus on improving conditions here on earth. We may differ about a future life, but atheists, Christians, and others can work together on concerns that matter in this life, like human rights, racial discrimination, the environment, poverty, peace, and other social justice issues. To conclude, I see no evidence for any gods. We can make up imagined needs of a god, but we know real needs of humans. That's why I value behavior over belief. Thank you.
In my opening speech, I laid out 4 lines of evidence: the origins of the universe, the fine-tuning of the cosmos, the origins of information, and the resurrection of Jesus. And Dr. Silverman had no response to most of these, except for the resurrection, and we'll look forward to his response to those others in his rebuttal. Regarding the resurrection, he made some comments about the Gospels and difficulties he has with those, but remember, I didn't use the Gospels in my argument for the resurrection. I didn't use the Bible at all. So even if the Bible had never been written, those facts that I put out there are still there and need an explanation. He made a comment about Justin Martyr, saying that, that Christianity borrowed from these pagan religions or pagan beliefs regarding resurrection. If you go on and read Justin Martyr, at the beginning, yes, he does say that the pagan beliefs did have virgin births, but he goes on later and says none of them had a resurrection. He says Jesus only appeared to a small band of followers. Remember the creed that I referred to? It said he appeared to 500, so that's more than a small band. Herb didn't really say if he's supporting the no or the maybe option to the last question yet. Hasn't really addressed the question yet, so let's look at some of the things he did say. He did say, quote, ethical values are derived from human needs and interests and are tested and refined by experience. There's a lot of disagreement on what is best for human needs and interests. At every election cycle, we hear every candidate declaring how they know what is best for people. If I may borrow a cliche from Dr. Silverman, they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. Should we dismiss all ideas on ethical values because there is disagreement, as Herb would think we should do with religion? Of course not. That's not rational. What we should recognize is that there's an objective standard to measure these various theories against. And what I mean by this objective standard is that there are some actions that are morally right or wrong, regardless of anyone's subjective opinion. The rightness or wrongness of actions is based on how they measure up to the objective moral standard. If we are to test and refine by experience, we must have an objective moral standard to compare to. Without an objective moral standard, any talk of moral progress or what works well is meaningless. We would only be able to speak of moral change. An example of what I think we could agree is objectively wrong would be murder. We might argue about whether or not some action qualifies as murder versus a justified killing, but all agree that if it qualifies as murder, it is wrong. And I hope we could all agree that that is more than just an opinion. Now I want to be clear that I'm not saying that you must be a Christian or even a theist to have good morals or even to know what good morals are. I'm also not saying that all morals are objective. But if there is even just one moral action that is objective, then the objective standard must exist. My argument is about the foundation of morals. Where are they rooted? In theistic belief, these morals can be rooted in the nature of God. They're one of the properties of God. In non-theistic worldviews, is there a place where objective morals could be rooted? I don't think so, but let's look at some of the options commonly given. Some say that morals are rooted in evolution, but I believe this fails. When we look at the behavior of animals, we see many acts that they do that we find immoral for humans to do. Since evolution is an undirected process, it is certainly plausible that it could have taken various different paths and leave humans with a different view of morality, maybe leading us to behave like those animals. When different groups of people disagree on moral actions, we would only be able to conclude that their evolution has just gone down slightly different paths. Neither group could really say the other is wrong. They could only conclude that they're just different. But few people really believe and live as if that is the way things really are. Many say that humans are sentient beings, capable of understanding right and wrong, and therefore we are morally accountable. but that just shows we're capable of discovering the morals, not establishing them. Some have proposed a moral framework that is based on human well-being, and this can be objective because science can show objective facts about what contributes to and what hinders human well-being. We can all agree that human well-being is good, but why think it defines the good? They just arbitrarily posit it as the good, but why should human well-being define the good instead of the well-being of snakes, rats, or bacteria? Under an undirected evolutionary framework, it wasn't necessary that humans would even come into existence. So it's hard to imagine how the well-being of an unnecessary life form could define the good. Also, some scenarios could be imagined where actions such as rape could actually benefit the well-being of the human species, but surely we know that rape is really wrong. Absent a non-theistic foundation for objective morals, we can use the following formula to summarize this argument. 1. For objective morals to exist, God must exist. 2. Objective morals do exist. 3. Therefore, God exists. That is another piece of evidence. We now know we're looking for a foundation for objective morals that is also a form of intelligence that is capable of designing, is also non-spatial, not bound by time, immaterial, and powerful. Now, Herb said that people's religions are the result of geographical location or culture that they live in or grew up in. This assertion says nothing about whether or not the Christian God exists. I'll make a few points about it, though. 1, the assertion he makes would apply to all views, not just the religious ones. Therefore, it would also be saying that people that are atheists are that simply because of their geographical location or culture. Second point, there are many, many real-life examples of people leaving the religious or non-religious beliefs of their cultures. Many of you here this evening are examples. Herb's own testimony of going from Orthodox Judaism to atheism is testament against his own assertion. Third point, if Herb intended this assertion to be an argument against the truth of Christianity, he's guilty of the genetic fallacy, which is the fallacy of drawing a conclusion about a claim based on the origins of the claim instead of the merits of the claim. Now, Herb argued that science has filled the gaps that were previously filled by God, also known as the God of the gaps. But remember, in my arguments, I didn't say, we don't know, therefore God's the best explanation. My conclusions are based on the evidence. The conclusion of God being the best explanation isn't based on what we don't know, but instead on what we do know. What about the assertion that with science we don't need a God? I find it interesting that some of the greatest scientists the world has ever known made some of the greatest discoveries did not see it that way. Isaac Newton's greatest work is known as the Principia. In the General Scholium, a sort of appendix to that work, Newton explains how he believes his discoveries are evidence for God. Now, before some dismiss Newton as being from far too long ago, before we had all the discoveries we have now, consider the following modern-time scientists. John Polkinghorne, physicist, discovered quarks, which make up protons and neutrons. He's a Christian, and now an Anglican priest. Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project, is a Christian. Francisco Ayala, one of the world's leading evolutionary biologists, is a Christian. George Ellis, one of the world's leading cosmologists, is a Christian. And let's not forget Greenville's own Charles Towns, one of the greatest scientists ever. We have a statue of him on Main Street. He came up with the laser, won the Nobel Prize, and was a Christian. These scientists don't see their discoveries as replacing God, but instead understanding how God did it. Now, Herb said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That sounds like common sense, but it's actually flawed. 1, what qualifies extraordinary is very subjective. 2, this assertion makes any non-mundane claim impossible. A miraculous claim would require miraculous evidence, and that evidence would require miraculous evidence, and this would go on for infinity. Point number 3, it is necessary to not only consider the claim, but also the possibility of the evidence if the claim is false. For example, we could look at the moon landings as an example. Most would say that a man walking on the moon is an extraordinary event. I don't know if we have extraordinary evidence for it, but we do have a lot of evidence for it. What if man had never walked on the moon? How likely would it be that the evidence would exist then? If the alternate explanations for the evidence are more implausible than the claim, then the claim needs to be seriously considered. And fourth point, the claim that someone is alive does not require extraordinary evidence. The claim that someone's dead does not require extraordinary evidence. The claim of the resurrection only requires evidence that a person was alive, and then the person was dead, and the person's alive again. The evidence of him being alive the second time would be no different than the evidence that he was alive the first time. Finally, Herb suggests that if we believe in Christianity, we should also accept Mormonism. Mormonism and Christianity do not agree on the nature of Christ or even God, so there's good reason I should be skeptical. Beyond that skepticism, though, we should look at the evidence. The core of Mormonism is the golden plates, but no one saw the plates except Joseph Smith. There are supposed witnesses, but if you read their testimony, you will find that they didn't see the plates, but they saw something that was covered on a table or in a box that they were told were the plates. No one actually saw the plates. Also, when some pages of the translation of the plates were lost, Smith was not able to go back and read the plates and reproduce those pages. There's good reason to be skeptical. It seems the arguments that I presented are still standing, and I don't believe Dr. Silverman has presented any reasons to doubt that the Christian God exists.
Bill mentioned I wasn't clear in the beginning about what position I take about the existence of the Christian God, maybe or no. So I'll make it clear, no. And, you know, I didn't say that everybody who grows up in a certain place is going to keep the same religion. I'm just saying that there seems to be more to the family you were raised in, even though there are exceptions. And speaking of exceptions, Bill did mention some people who are Christians and are also outstanding scientists. Sure, there are exceptions for almost all sorts of things, but 93% of the National Academy of Sciences, the most prestigious science organization in the world, consists of those who don't believe in a personal God. Now, in my rebuttal, I'll respond to Bill's 5 arguments from his opening: cosmological fine-tuning, DNA, objective morality, and the existence of the Christian God. I'll spend more time on his Christian God argument because that's the topic of this debate. Now, he mentioned DNA. I think DNA, which was not known at the time of Darwin, gives more evidence of evolution. For instance, 98% of human DNA is the same as chimpanzees. And even more startling, we share 50% of DNA with bananas. Now, the cosmological and fine-tuning arguments that Bill mentioned are philosophical, first proposed around the time of Aristotle, and are arguments for an unmoved mover, not the Christian God. Bill updates these ancient arguments by adding some unresolved scientific claims. His cosmological argument is that whatever came into existence has a cause. Our universe came into existence with the Big Bang, so Bill claims an uncreated creator caused the Big Bang. But the Big Bang was a quantum event, and quantum events don't necessarily need a cause. Prominent cosmologists describe why our universe might have arisen spontaneously through quantum fluctuations, why universes can create themselves from nothing, or that string theory explains why our universe is part of a multiverse. There isn't enough evidence yet to fully support any of these origin theories about universes. So, the most reasonable position to take for now is, we don't know. Bill is correct that a universe hospitable to life must conform to strict conditions, but his fine-tuning argument from design falsely assumes we have a firm grasp on the probabilities involved. Scientists today estimate there are about 1 trillion planets in our galaxy, and over 100 billion galaxies in the universe. Improbable things do happen, and even if the probability of life were only 1 in 100 trillion, life would be expected on 1 billion planets, and Earth is just one of them. Bill mentioned Stephen Hawking and his view about singularity with Penrose in 1970. However, Hawking updated these views much later when he changed his mind because of calculations that had not taken into account quantum mechanics. Hawking said that because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is why there is something rather than nothing, why our universe exists and why we exist. Design might have seemed reasonable prior to Darwin, who showed that the illusion of design depends on gradual adaptations over a long period of time. With humans, one of the fortuitous outcomes. Had it not been for an asteroid that destroyed dinosaurs some 65 million years ago, primates like us would probably never have evolved. Natural selection is a well-confirmed explanation for life's complexity. God did it is not. Bill also asserts that objective morality exists, and then concludes that these moral standards must be grounded outside of humanity, meaning morality comes from a God. It sounds like Bill is assuming that God exists, the objective morality giver, in order to claim that God exists. Now, whether morality is objective or subjective has no practical value. Even if we believe in objective absolutes, we're forced to make human judgments on how to interpret them. Christians have always been on different sides of moral issues, as they are today on capital punishment, euthanasia, contraception, abortion, war, same-sex marriage, and immigration. Here's an example of a changing Christian morality that has a local flavor. Richard Furman, who had been pastor of First Baptist Church in Charleston, where I live, has a university right here in Greenville named in his honor. In 1838, Reverend Furman said, "Since slavery is justifiable by scriptural authority, its morality is also proved, for the divine law never sanctions immoral action." I doubt that anyone here or at Furman University still supports this biblically based morality. Unfortunately, the monotheistic religions continue to admire Abraham as a man of such great faith that he was willing to kill his son because God told him to do it. Countless people have since applied their morality to commit atrocities in the name of God. Morality evolves over time as we better understand human needs, which is why even many Christians apply evidence-based secular morality. We make judgments about which portions of ancient holy books to take literally, which to take figuratively, and which to ignore. Finally, I'll address the argument for Jesus' resurrection, which, as Bill says, and most Christians believe to be the foundation of Christianity. If we don't accept the resurrection on blind faith, as many do, we should examine the evidence carefully. Ideally, we'd like eyewitness testimony, as well as independent, consistent, unbiased sources. But the Christian Bible is not historically reliable. The Gospel authors who never met Jesus based their writings on oral traditions and embellished tales that had been in circulation for decades, and then add their own spin to it. Many scholars maintain that the New Testament was created to promote certain political and religious viewpoints. For instance, Elaine Pagels, professor of religion at Princeton University, showed how Orthodox Christians gained political advantages over Gnostic Christians by offering followers a resurrection that was physical, not merely spiritual. Bill claimed that Paul said that 500 people at once saw the resurrected Jesus. But Paul didn't mention who, where, when, or how he knew. Were they spiritual visions? Ancient people had no trouble believing in visions. In fact, in Galatians, Paul admits that he only saw Jesus in a vision. He wrote, "The gospel I preach is not of human origin. I received it by revelation." And according to Matthew 17, Moses and Elijah appeared to Jesus, James, and John. Was Moses resurrected, or was this also a vision? And what about all those resurrected Jews mentioned in Matthew 27 who left their graves, went to Jerusalem, and were seen by many? Sounds like another vision, or maybe just a made-up story. Bill's resurrection arguments are circular because he assumes the Christian Bible is historically accurate in order to authenticate the resurrection. But there are no sources outside the Christian Bible that even mention a resurrection of Jesus, which Roman writers would certainly have noted. And Bill did mention the Jewish historian Josephus, who referred to Jesus, the brother of James. Yet he said nothing about a resurrection. In fact, Josephus wrote more about John the Baptist than about Jesus. If belief in a resurrection is necessary for salvation, wouldn't the merciful God provide evidence to outsiders? Furthermore, the gospel stories disagree on essential details, including when Jesus was crucified, number of angels or people at an empty tomb, who first saw the tomb, who first saw Jesus after the resurrection, where he appeared, how many appearances. There's virtually not one detail of the crucifixion and resurrection narratives on which all four Gospels agree. Such unreliable stories would never hold up in a court of law. We'd expect such discrepancies from people writing down oral histories decades after Jesus' death. But would a perfect God inspire such a garbled account about what Christians believe to be the most important event in world history? The numerous contradictions should establish beyond reasonable doubt the fallible, purely human origins of resurrection stories. In conclusion, I accept historical references that Jesus lived and died, but I find no credible evidence for biblical and non-historical beliefs that Jesus died and lived again. Therefore, I can't accept the existence of a so-called Christian God.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your opening statements and your opening rebuttals. Now begins the up to 20 minutes for questions of each other. You may go ahead and proceed from there. Bill, you have the... Okay.
Oh, okay.
Or if you don't mind, just pulling your mic closer to you. Thank you.
You know, you talked about the resurrection, but you didn't say why within Christianity that's important. I assume because belief in the resurrection gets you to heaven. And if you don't believe, then you wind up in hell. I know most Christians seem to have that belief. I wonder if you do as well.
It's to get to heaven isn't the motivation or why the resurrection is important. The resurrection is to reconcile us to God, to a relationship with God. To me, if we were to define heaven and hell, heaven is that relationship with God. Hell is to be out of that relationship with God. So the resurrection is the means that God came up with to reconcile us to Him.
What do you think happens when we die? Does belief matter more than behavior in this life?
Let me answer that with some rhetorical questions. Do we all believe that there should be a penalty for moral wrongs? If we do, then have we ever committed a moral wrong? So if we have, and I think if we're all honest, we'd probably say, yeah, we have. In that case, there should be a penalty. So in this case of the resurrection, talking of Christianity, we're talking about the penalty would be separating us from that God. So what we would want is we want to be pardoned. We get that offer of being pardoned. If we accept that offer, then when we die, we are in relation. Actually, even before we die, we can be in that relationship with God. But if we die without that, accepting that pardon, then we're going to accept the penalty that we all think we should deserve.
Well, I'll first admit to making mistakes in my life, the moral judgments. But it seems if somebody like Gandhi, who also made mistakes but didn't accept Jesus, doesn't get a happier afterlife than, say, somebody like Hitler, who might have converted and accepted Jesus a minute before he dies and get a better afterlife than Gandhi. Does that seem reasonable to you, and do you share that belief?
Yes. Well, here's what I believe, that if we think of God, God's a perfect being. And as I said, heaven is the relationship with God. If we think of these scientific labs, these sterile scientific labs that you see the people, they got to put on the hoodies and everything, the booties, and you just got to be totally clean to go in there, or you're going to destroy whatever it is they're studying in there. That's how it is with God. Nothing dirty can enter the relationship with God. Nothing sinful can enter in your relationship with God. So when we ask about Gandhi, Hitler, whoever, if they have any sin in them, they're not eligible, they're not worthy to get in it. They're going to destroy the relationship. So none of us deserve to be in a relationship with God.
Well, let's say you have that relationship with God because you suddenly accepted Jesus before you died. So then you have that relationship in heaven. Do you have free will in heaven? And if so, it seems like you can sin again and then lose that relationship and go to hell or whatever. Whereas if you can't sin, then you're just one of God's robots. So what's your view that happens?
That's a good question. It's an open question amongst Christians that's debated. Since you're asking me personally, I think we will have free will in heaven, but that we won't act, for some reason, I guess being in the presence of God, we will not take the evil option. But that's just speculation. The scriptures really don't give us a lot of details on that to go by.
Well, if you're quoting scriptures, there are various passages that say if you believe, you go to heaven, otherwise you're doomed to the fires of hell. So it seems like most Christians, you pick and choose which part of the Bible to accept and which parts to ignore, and even who real Christians are, because Mormons consider themselves real Christians. And I expect the thing I hear in common with Christians is, I don't consider those people next door Christians. I'm the true Christian.
Yeah, well,
how do you decide?
Well, let me get back to where you started with this, because I was addressing your question.
Yeah.
We have free will in heaven. I was saying we don't have scriptures telling us a whole lot about those details. As far as that we look at, okay, I like heaven better than the idea of hell, so that's why we choose it. And I don't see it that way. I see it as a relationship. Think of it this way. I met your wife here earlier. If you were to say, okay, I married her because I looked at her and I looked at the other option I had, and the other option wasn't that good, so I married her instead. That's how you're related in heaven and hell, but that's not what it is. You married her because you love her, because you want to be with her, I'm assuming.
Well, here's one thing I do agree with Bill on.
You weren't weighing out the options and saying, well, yeah, I'd better marry this one because I'm not going to get any better chances than this one. And that's the way you seem to be presenting heaven and hell. And that's not the way it is for Christians. We become Christians because we love God, because we want to be in that relationship with Him.
But does behavior here matter? Can you still love God and still behave horribly and maybe even kill people because you heard the voice of God telling you to kill that infidel? as has happened.
We are all humans and we are all failing. And
But is that a failure, or maybe this is showing love of God and God would appreciate the fact that you killed in his name?
no, I think that would be a misunderstanding.
Well, there are a lot of Christians, like in the Crusades and afterwards, that had that misunderstanding. So I think based on what I said earlier, what we learned about human rights and all, that a lot of Christians have changed and accepted more of a secular morality rather than a biblically based morality that does talk about killing the infidel.
I would disagree. I would think it's gone just as much the other way. You mentioned,
I can quote if you'd like.
I believe you mentioned slavery in
Yes.
your speech about how there were preachers that used Scripture to support the use, and at the same time there was people using Scripture to stop slavery.
Well, I even said that Christians have been on all sides of just about any issue, and I know I could, you know Scripture better than me, I assume, but I can give scriptural arguments on position A or position not A, which is part of the problem to me. If a loving God wanted people to accept the Scripture that you accept, it seems he would have made it unambiguous and given evidence for well-meaning seekers to wind up being believers. I think I try to be rational, I look for evidence, as do most atheists, and we just find no evidence for Jesus' resurrection, which is at the heart of it, other than what's in the Christian Bible.
Well, I think I did present evidence tonight, and I didn't use the Bible.
Well, you mentioned Paul, and that's part of the Christian Bible too. It's not the gospel.
I mentioned a creed that Paul included. Paul did not create that creed. The scholars, Christian and non-Christian, accept that creed as being they call it pre-Pauline. It existed before him. It existed before the New Testament.
Do you know the names of these non-Christian scholars?
Yes. In fact, I'll give them to you.
Okay, well, that could be later. That might
Well,
be
I'll just
getting in
name
the weeds.
Gerd Muellerman, Robert Funk. Those are two of them.
And what did they experience Jesus' resurrection, or did they just say this is part of a creed?
What I had said was they accepted this creed was early, very early, possibly within 2 years of the crucifixion, and that is pre-New Testament.
So you're saying that they accepted that there was a resurrection because other people
Obviously, if
said
they
there
accepted
was.
it, they wouldn't be non-Christian scholars, they would be Christian scholars then.
So, okay, so there's, why do you think then there aren't more Christians? Like this, it says in the Gospels that this was preaching to the Jews, but it seemed that Jesus was only interested in bringing the Jews into a certain belief, and he didn't much care about the non-Jews. And I could give you quotes on
Well,
that.
yeah, I know which quotes you're referring to. Yeah, I think it's Jesus was coming to the Jews first, and then they were given a task of going out, which is what the disciples, the apostles, did after his death.
Well, I started asking you a question. I think you should be asking me.
Okay, and you brought up one that I was planning on asking. You've said there's no evidence. Give us an example of what you would accept as evidence.
Of a resurrection, or of Jesus' resurrection?
Let's just start with simple. Give us an example of what you would accept as evidence for God.
Well, I would primarily go for whatever science can find. There are different levels. When I say absolutely no, for the Christian God, I have no belief in that. I would believe more in a deistic God, just as some of the founders in this country during the Enlightenment, before they knew about evolution and the Big Bang, that how did this all start? And they believed that there was some creator who created the universe and set the natural laws in motion, and then retired as deity emeritus. That kind of God would make more sense. And if there were any kind of evidence for it, I would accept it, but I just see no evidence, scientific or otherwise, for any gods, and especially the Christian God, because it's based on what I consider a story for which there's no basis. I'd put it in the same category as Zeus or other mythical gods.
So you told us what kind of God you would believe. You didn't answer the question, though. What kind of evidence would you accept for that God?
Well, if there could be some kind of scientific evidence that led to only a God could have done that, or if suddenly I saw in the sky something, God will do this tomorrow, and something that seems very strange, and that comes to pass. Because when I read the Bible, all the scientific evidence, for instance, seemed to be nothing that rose above the time that the Bible was written, which says to me the Bible was just written by humans. The same with human rights. Some people are a little ahead of their times, like let's treat slaves kindly, but not something that I would think anyone in this century would write about either science or human rights, some of the bad things that I see in the Bible. And a God, I would think, would rise above the time. So it wouldn't be a God of the Bible, but a God who, or anyone who could make predictions for which that evidence would be so astounding, I'd be inclined to believe.
So what you described sounds familiar to me. A miracle in the sky that was told that it would happen. If you're familiar with the miracle of the sun and the Lady of Fatima, that sounds exactly what you would accept, but you didn't experience it. Is that why you wouldn't accept it, because you didn't experience it?
Well, let's talk about a miracle of the sun. Joshua needed an extra daylight so he could kill more people. So God stopped the sun from moving to give extra daylight. Now that seems like a view of the people of ancient times who wrote the Bible, and they thought that the sun revolves around the earth instead of the other way around. And in fact, Galileo was imprisoned for that, for saying that. So this is what I mean. If we look at the Bible, it's, to me, obvious it was written by humans. They were a product of their time. And when we look at the science of the sun, or that we have a flat earth with four corners and various other scientific contradictions, I find it hard to accept that this is the word of a supernatural being, and I might add, as by definition, a super scientist as well.
Yes.
Well, you made a lot of comments of Joshua in the Bible, but once again, none of my arguments relied on the Bible. I mean, I could make every argument whether the Bible was ever written or not, all the arguments I did. And it seems that there is a miracle out there that seems to fit the type of miracle you would accept. It's a Catholic miracle. I'm not Catholic, but I know it's one that they hold dear. And the only thing is you didn't personally experience it. So,
Well, there's a difference between somebody saying they experienced a miracle and they might believe that, just as there are sincere believers who feel they've been abducted by aliens and then come back to planet Earth. I don't doubt a lot of their sincere beliefs. Do I believe that that actually happened? No. And I don't believe other so-called miracles that I've heard about.
that gets back to my original question. What type of thing would you believe? It seems like there isn't anything you would believe. It doesn't seem like there's any evidence you would believe for God.
Well, at the moment, I don't have any evidence, but as I said, if there were some scientific predictions that I heard or written or saw written in the sky or came down from tablets above, and I saw that these incredible pieces of information come to be true the next day, or the next month or so, then I'm going to probably believe that there was something I just did not understand, and I might want to call that a God. Or there might be aliens from another planet who came to Earth and could give me evidence that they started this universe and then went on to better universes. This was just an experiment, and they could show me how they did that. Then I'd believe that these aliens started it, and if you want to call these aliens gods, so be it.
I think we've exhausted that question. Go and ask your next question.
Okay, let me quote Albert Mohler, who was president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Time magazine called the reigning intellectual of the evangelical movement. And he says the Adam and Eve story goes to the heart of Christianity. The whole point of the crucifixion and resurrection was to undo Adam's original sin. Without Adam, the work of Christ makes no sense. Do you agree with that? And the first couple, Adam and Eve, and the talking snake to with it.
Regarding Adam, I mean, this is debated. It's original sin. Do we believe that? Some believe that Adam sinned and Eve sinned. Let's not put all the blame on the male. That it's genetically passed on from person to person. I personally don't believe that. We've done our own sins. We don't believe on Adam's sins. I believe Adam was the first one to introduce sin into the world, so we could use that as original sin. But if we look at it in that perspective, that Adam brought it into the world, Jesus takes the sin out of the world, at least the payment for the sin out of the world. So yes, Jesus is correcting what began back with Adam.
Well, does that mean you believe that Adam and Eve and the talking snake were real, and there was a Garden of Eden where this all happened?
Yes.
Okay. And without Adam and Eve eating that forbidden fruit, there might not have been a sin in the world, and that's the only reason Jesus had to die a painful death because of what Adam and Eve did.
Well,
Because
yeah,
again, the crucifixion makes no sense to me either. Let alone that might have actually happened, but Jesus coming, or God coming down as a human to have a painful death as the only way to atone for what Adam, Eve, and the talking snake did, just doesn't make sense to me.
let me come back to the question you asked.
Yeah.
You kept on going. Regarding if Adam had never sinned, would Jesus have to come down? I can only speak for myself. Knowing myself, I would have sinned. So then he would have had to come down. And I think most everyone in here would have sinned at some point. It's not just Adam, it's for all of our sins that he came down. Now your question is about understanding the crucifixion, the resurrection. That's doctrines of atonement. We could go on for hours explaining that.
Well, let me talk about, then ask you a question about sin and atonement. What happened to me once, I got in it might have been a debate or some public appearance, and somebody wrote a nasty letter about me in our local paper. Then she later met me and saw I wasn't such a bad guy. And then later she wrote to me saying, because of that, I realized I sinned in what I said about you. So I asked Jesus for forgiveness. And I told her, I think it would have been better to ask me. And I think that's part of a problem I see where people commit sins and then this, well, how do I atone for this sin? I ask Jesus instead of trying to make good for the sins that you committed.
I don't disagree that we should go to the people we've sinned against, but I don't dismiss that person's asking Jesus for forgiveness as well, because ultimately God owns all life. He's the origins of good and bad, so we owe everything to him.
Or, I forget whose turn it is for the
I
question.
think I've got one more question.
Gentlemen, that is 20 minutes, but Bill, did you have questions that you would
Yeah,
like to ask?
let me ask one more. We'll just get a quick answer on it. Would it be correct to say that you behave the way you do because you believe it is the way people ought to behave?
Yeah, I think of myself as trying to be good without any God belief. I don't feel the need to fear God as we're supposed to do in order to get rewards afterward. I don't see Jesus or God as a particular role model when I read the Bible. And let me ask that back of you. How would your behavior toward other people change if you were to no longer believe in a God? I thought this is a discussion, so you're asking about my moral behavior.
Let me continue mine, but
Sure.
I will answer your question,
Okay,
because I did want to answer.
Okay.
But you're saying that what you believe about the way people ought to behave
Yeah.
does influence how you behave.
Yes.
Okay, so when you say you think belief is, or behavior is more important than belief, but really you're saying your belief about how people should behave is more important than how other people believe.
Well, what I'm saying is we've learned over centuries what has worked well, what hasn't worked well. That certainly murder is wrong, killing babies is wrong, even though it's justified in the Bible. But, you know, there's certain kinds of behavior, and we should, even some biblical behavior, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I agree with that, as well as parts of other holy books and mostly non-holy books.
Okay, but still, your belief is influencing your behavior, whereas you were saying your behavior is more important than belief, implying that other people's behavior
I
is
actually meant
influenced
belief in Jesus.
Right. So you're just saying that
Yeah.
behavior, as you believe, is more important than behavior as other people believe.
Or what we've learned through evidence over centuries about what works well in a livable society and what doesn't. And wars don't work well. Negotiating, looking for win-win situations. But again, would you change if you stopped believing?
Yeah, would I behave differently
Yeah.
if I didn't believe Christianity? Remember in my objective moral argument, I said that I wasn't arguing that you had to be a Christian to understand objective morals or even a theist. So you know, if I stopped believing, then I think I would still, as a human, I'd still recognize the objective moral standard that's out there. Now if you were to come back and say, oh, well, I'm talking about there is no God, not just that I believe there's no God, but there is no God, then I'd have to consider the idea that, you know, there is no objective morality, culture shapes what's right and wrong, and I really can't answer how I would behave then because I'd have to see how culture would shape it. Since we don't live in a world with no God, I can't answer that.
Well, yes we do, but that's aside the point. No, but you focus on morals being objective, and to me, whether it's objective or subjective doesn't make a difference unless we know what the morals should be. It sounds like you're saying there's some kind of objective morals, but you don't know what it is. And you don't even get those morals from the Bible because Christians disagree. So to me, it's how you act in a moral way.
But you say we don't
And
know.
tell me can you tell me what you mean by objective morals, other than it exists somewhere, but we have no idea what it is?
The objective is that it's not our opinion. If we were to say, an example that's often given is if the Nazis had won World War II, and they eliminated anyone that disagreed with them, brainwashed them, killed them, whatever, what they did would still be wrong.
Right.
Even though
I would agree
even
with
though
that,
there's no one left.
especially being a Jew.
Yeah. Yeah, the objective is that it's beyond human, and it's just not that people thought this or whatever. You said we don't know what they are, but we do. I mentioned murder, and I'm sure you would say murder is wrong. Would you think that later on people might change and murder would be actually right?
No, well, see, my personal views are certain things are always wrong, but they're always on the margins. Like, what about gay marriage, for instance? I expect we disagree on that. Is that immoral, in your opinion?
I would say, well, marriage has a definition. Yeah, that whole discussion was about a redefinition. And I would say homosexual lifestyle is wrong. I would base that on the Bible. I wouldn't base that on.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I could base it on. Remember in my objective moral argument, I gave the example that some people try to make objective morals based on human needs and what's best for a human flourishing human needs. And I think an argument could be made that homosexuality is a hindrance to human needs. You know, that I could do it.
Yeah. And well, we would certainly differ on that and your biblical view. And in terms of the Bible, you say marriage is between a man and a woman. I find biblical passages where marriage is between a man and 700 women, as was the case with Solomon, whose brain wasn't necessarily his most important part. And Abraham had more than one wife, so it wasn't always in the Bible between a man and a woman. You're just quoting selected parts.
And there's many people in the Bible that they're not put out there always as saints. You know, David and Solomon, as you put it out there.
Abraham was.
They all had their faults. They're all shown to be human.
Yeah.
And God is willing to forgive everyone.
And Paul said you shouldn't marry, but if you have to, better to marry than burn. And that's another view of marriage which I would not accept.
Gentlemen, we have exceeded our 20-minute limit for that period. We're going to move on to closing statements. Offering the closing statement first will be Bill.
Let me start off by saying if you're interested in learning more about Christian apologetics, then consider joining us at the monthly Reasonable Faith Greenville meetings. Just contact me afterwards for more information. Now let's review the arguments I presented to see if they still stand. I did the origins of the universe. Remember, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Dr. Silverman said there's quantum theories that show things coming into existence uncaused. We don't need a cause. In quantum mechanics, we can't make exact predictions, but instead make probabilistic predictions. This doesn't mean it's uncaused. Things that begin without a cause could not be predicted even probabilistically. He mentioned multiverse theories, string theories, which I included that in my opening presentation. Those are excluded by the BGV and the second law of thermodynamics. They must have a cause. As far as string theory goes, many argue that it's not even science. Lawrence Krauss says it's not testable and therefore isn't science. Neil deGrasse Tyson has given up any hope that it will lead to anything. So those aren't getting us out of that argument. It seems the origins of the universe argument still stands. For the fine-tuning of the universe, remember I talked about the fine-tuning of the cosmos and the origins of information. Herb appealed to the evolution as a designer, but random mutation and natural selection is about the origins of the species. It says nothing about the fine-tuning of the universe or the origins of information. In fact, if there was no fine-tuning of the universe, then biological evolution could never take place. And I explained earlier that evolution requires the information before it could even get started if it did. Regarding the resurrection of Jesus, he came back to this, made some more comments about the Gospels, but remember, I didn't use the Bible in my argument for the resurrection. He said, why did Jesus appear to just a small band of followers? Well, remember the creed I quoted said 500 people. He complains because, well, he didn't name those 500. Well, it was probably known to people back then. It's like they're still alive. You can still go talk to them. They're passing this creed around in the local area. And as I said earlier, the creed predates the New Testament. As far as objective morality, as we just talked about, he says we don't really know what it is. And that's a problem of epistemology, not ontology. Epistemology is how we know something. Ontology is about what is. And that's what my argument about morality has been tonight. What is right and what is wrong, not about how we understand what is right and what is wrong. And it does seem that we do understand murder and rape, things like that, are wrong. So it appears the arguments still stand. So we have good reason to believe that the Christian God exists. But so what? Is it just a piece of trivia to know, or does it have significance to all of us? If Christianity is true, then there is a God who created us for a purpose. That purpose is to know him, be in a relationship with him, and worship him. But God is perfect, and we're not. Just like those sterile laboratories I talked about where nothing unclean can enter into the relationship with God. But God loves us so much that he devised a way that we could be cleaned and then permitted into relationship with him. This, of course, was the death of Jesus on the cross and subsequent resurrection. As the creed I referred to earlier says, he died for our sins. It's not the sins of Adam that keep us from God. It's not things that we say Satan made us do. It's our own freely chosen sins that keep us from God. But thankfully, by the grace of God, this is one time we don't have to be responsible for our own actions. If we were, we would all be doomed to eternity, separated from him, the foundation of all that is good and loving. I know many of you have Christian backgrounds, but have since left for various reasons. Some of you have never really given it any serious thought. I encourage all of you to take a good look at Christ. Take some time to read the book of John. Focus on Christ, not the failed Christians. Don't let the failures of Christians keep you from your gift from God. I want to thank Sean for moderating and organizing all of this. I want to thank Dr. Silverman for a good discussion, or Herb. He asked me to call him Herb, and I've been slipping up calling him Dr. Silverman. I apologize. Thank you all for being here this evening, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
And thanks to you both. Yeah. Bill did present some logical arguments tonight, but logical arguments don't necessarily mean the conclusion is true unless all the premises, the assumptions, are true. For example, here's a perfectly logical and valid argument. All lights that shine in the night are made of green cheese. The moon is a light that shines in the night. Therefore, the moon is made of green cheese. This logical argument starts with a false assumption, which leads to a false conclusion. A cartoon on the office door of many mathematicians has one mathematician explaining his complicated multi-step proof. Another mathematician interrupts and says, "I think you should be more explicit in step 2. Step 2 says, "Then a miracle occurs." In Bill's arguments for the Christian God, he was not explicit enough in his various versions of step 2. Though Bill and I disagree on many issues, I found tonight that he's a really nice guy. So, if at some point I unintentionally offended Bill, I hope he'll forgive me. Here's what Bill would not say to me. "The only way I can possibly forgive you, Herb, is if you were to take one of my lovely daughters out there and kill her." Of course, this scenario is ludicrous, but it sounds to me a lot like the essence of Christianity, where a prerequisite for a Father God to forgive humans who unintentionally offended him is for humans to kill his son. Does that sound like a role model for a loving father? My purpose here is not to convert you to atheism. Each of us must find a path that enables us to live healthy and productive lives while helping our fellow human beings. My purpose is to encourage you to think critically. Some of your questions may have been answered tonight, but I hope you leave with more questions, because one of the best ways to learn is through questioning and by hearing many sides of an issue. Please continue to read and study the Bible. It is an important part of Western culture, whether or not you believe in God. But also read biblical criticism. With this in mind, permit me to put on my professor hat and give you your homework assignment. And that's to read the following 10 books. You don't have to read them all this week. A Demon-Haunted World by Carl Sagan. Why People Believe Weird Things. Michael Shermer. Who Wrote the Bible? Richard Friedman. Who Wrote the New Testament? Burton Mack. The History of God. Karen Armstrong. Why I Am Not a Christian. Bertrand Russell. The God Delusion. Richard Dawkins. God Is Not Great. Christopher Hitchens. And to round out my top 10, I admit to not being objective because I include my 2 books, which you are fond over there, Candidate Without a Prayer and An Atheist Stranger in a Strange Religious Land. I have copies of this list of 10 books for those interested, and you can also contact me at my website, herbsilverman.com. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you Christians here, especially Bill, for ignoring the words of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:14. The passage says, "Believers must not commune with unbelievers. What fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? Light with darkness? Believers with infidels?" And this infidel thanks you all for your attention and interest in this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you both for a very informative and cordial debate amongst you two. We're now going to open up to audience questions. There is